Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. And just as a reminder, this is our second Minisode, which is our way of debriefing the last 4 episodes that we did. So it's a monthly episode and our quick updates of things that are going on with the podcast and with this project.
So first, a quick update, and again, thank you. So we have surpassed over 3,000 unique downloads for the podcast, which after a month is just like incredible for a podcast like this. So thank you so much for your continued support. Thank you to all the folks who have been willing to be interviewed. Thank you for you all who have suggested people for us to interview, for the people who have shared it with your students or with your colleagues or with your friends. We continue to just be so overwhelmed by the amount of support, which includes support on Twitter. Again, within that first month, we've surpassed 1,200 follows, which is just so heartwarming for Jess and I that you all are interested in this project and that you all are willing to continue to support not only us, but also the folks who are really doing this radical work, even as we still figure out exactly what that radical work means and what it is. As we discussed in some of our episodes, it's still a living definition that we're coming to together. We want to just give a very special shout out to the folks that we've been able to interview over the last month, some of whose episodes have come out already, and some of whom we are very excited to release their episodes very soon. So this includes Seda Gerses, Sarah Myers-West, Ruha Benjamin, Lily Irani, Karen Howe, Abeba Berhani, Yoon So-jo, Timnit Gebru, some of the upcoming interviews with Miriam Sweeney and Emily Bender, among others. So this is a very exciting time for Jess and I, because these, again, are folks that we really respect. And the fact that they're willing to sit down with us is just such an honor, and it's such a great learning experience for us in our own research, and then also to be able to share their stories beyond their research with each of you.
Yeah, this is such a fun journey. I am having such a blast on this podcast and with these interviews. And Dylan and I, we discovered that an interview with someone isn't the best way for all of you to get to know us very well. So that's one of the intentions with these minisodes as well. And then also we are going to be doing a fun Q&A episode in the future. And this can be questions about different things that we're doing with our research, and also just who we are and how we're running this podcast and this project. So if you have any questions for us related to anything, honestly, feel free to send us a tweet or an email. Ask your burning questions and we will do our best to answer them.
We are open books. We are 2 open books. Jess, I wonder if it would be helpful for us to say, just maybe in a sentence or two, again, who we are and where we're studying and what we're studying.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Especially because people are listening to our voices every week and they might not even know who we are. Yeah, so I'll go first. I'm Jess. My full name is Jessie, which is probably what you'll see online a lot. I am researching at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and my research interests lie at the intersection of algorithmic fairness and bias, and social science and philosophical fairness and bias, trying to build a bridge between the two.
And my name is Dylan Doyle Burke. Formally, I'm Reverend Dylan Doyle Burke, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. I'm still serving a congregation, and through that journey, I am I found myself in this PhD program in religious studies, studying artificial intelligence ethics. And specifically, I'm looking at robot-human interaction and morality and questions of what it means to be human. And I'm also dipping my toes into public policy and a little bit about sociology and digital spaces right now. I'm still early in my PhD, so it changes. So if you ask, maybe that would be a good segment on this episode, actually, on these minisodes, is just where's our research now, as it changes every few weeks. But that's a little bit about,
or as it changes every interview.
That's right. It's one of the amazing things about these interviews, right? Is that they alter how we think about these topics pretty radically, I guess, pun intended, every time, because the folks that we're talking about provide new lenses for us to think about the same issues, which it's an incredible experience.
Definitely. Yeah. And some quick other final updates before we dive into the rest of this minisode. We are working on new branding. So stay tuned for that. It's coming very soon. And also, if you would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you know someone who might like to be a guest on the podcast, please introduce yourself or introduce us to whoever you have in mind. And we also are hoping to do a student panel in the near future. We're experimenting with the idea of panels. So if you and some of your colleagues in a lab maybe would like to discuss some of the awesome work that you're doing in the AI ethics space, please let us know, and we would love to have you on.
A quick note on the branding. We really want this new branding to be representative of many different experiences of radicality, and really to cast or to draw a wide circle around what this terminology of radical means. So we've been talking with folks about ways that we could be more representative, and we'll talk more about that process of creating a brand and kind of where we're heading with this Radical AI project, in addition to the podcast, more on our next minisode next month. So please stay tuned for that.
And without further ado, let's dive in to our monthly debrief.
Drum roll, please. Jess, do we have a drum roll? Okay, well, we'll just play the music. Okay, we'll play the music. All right, so let's talk about the last 4 episodes that we've released over the past month in our debrief. And the way I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do this debrief, but the way that I wanted to begin for myself, just to organize my thoughts, is by pulling out some quotes from each of them. So we'll go episode by episode with Jess and I talking a little bit about our takeaways after we've had a little time to digest from the interview and from the episode, and after we've heard a little bit of feedback from you all, of the audience, about these episodes. So let's begin with Shamika's episode. And one quote that I pulled out from Shamika's episode is that she said, "For me, I believe that the divine exists in everything. The divine is omniscient, present everywhere all the time, and that includes the bits and bytes, the zeros and the ones, the digital space. So for me," she said, "it makes sense that God would be online in an app and the screen." And obviously, I've been sitting with this a lot, as concept of, where the divine is, especially in this, as a minister, in this weird world where my congregation can't meet. What does it mean for us to be bringing more of our communities into this online space? How does it change what meaning is and what purpose is, and even what community is, when we're subverting some of the norms that we've created over, hundreds of years of how religious community operates? And so this concept for me is really powerful that Shamika brought up about that the divine can exist in the bits and bytes. And I've just been reflecting a lot about, well, what does that actually mean when you lose that materiality of either worship together or of just like being together? And so Jess and I are now recording this podcast, separately, always on Zoom. So like, what does that mean for our dynamic as we still continue to grow as podcasters, and our relationships with our guests as well? Because we are trying to build a community. So I've just been thinking about that a lot, about how purpose and meaning shifts when you move from the material world to the digital world, or even if it does. Like, is it the same substance, if you will, that meaning and community that we're creating, or whether that necessarily shifts because we're not in that same material place?
Yeah, wow. I've definitely been also called to reassess my relationship with technology from Shamika's episode, and I've been sitting with this a lot lately, especially in the times of this pandemic and quarantine. I am such a technological skepticist in my life. And it's very hard for me to take a step back and to admit that technology is good, which I probably need to do more often in this field that I'm in. But I just really liked that Shamika made me think twice about the way that I think about the technology that I use. And maybe divine isn't the right word for me, but I think I do look at my technology and I see more than a piece of metal. I see that it is the ability to connect me with other people. It's the ability for me to honestly just conduct my day-to-day life in times like this where I have to work from home every single day. So I am taking away from this kind of just a greater like gratitude and appreciation for the tools that I have and for the technology that's at my fingertips. Because I think it's always good to just feel gratitude for honestly the amazing ability that we have to connect to the entire world in, the push of a button. And I can hold something in my hand that 100 years ago took up over an entire room. It's definitely, it is magic, and maybe divine is a good word to use. I don't know. I'm still figuring that out, but I definitely, I'm taking a step away from my skepticism, and I'm feeling much more hopeful and grateful for the little piece of metal that I carry in my hands.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jess, about that skepticism versus hope. And I think that like all of our interviews in the past month that we've released have played with that tension of how do we critique while also holding on to hope? How do we like not fall into that like abject despair? So that's my segue to move into the Sarah Myers West episode. But I also do want to again say thank you to Shamika for coming on the show, and also thank you to the program that you're in at CU Boulder for creating space for someone like Shamika to be able to do something in terms of this, theology, womanism, technology space, to be able to continue to create that, because I think it shows, at least in part, some shifts that we're seeing occurring out in institutions that are making room for more nuanced and more interdisciplinary conversations to happen across disciplines, which I think is so needed in technology spaces. So I don't know, I'm very grateful for Shamika for continuing to pave the way in those conversations, among others, in her field, and also for your institution for creating that space.
Shout out to CU Boulder Information Science Department.
That's right. And of course, a shout out in that to your advisor, Dr. Casey Fiesler, who's also been serving as a mentor for me as well. So just slight shout out to her.
Lots of thanks to go around.
That's right. But that was my segue to the Sarah Myers West episode. Of course, Dr. West, who is currently serving as a postdoc for the AI Now Institute at NYU. And the quote that I pulled out from her when we asked her about, a piece of advice that she would give, and I believe this was a piece of advice that I invited her to give to herself or to other younger women who are embarking on computer science. And the first piece of advice that she gave was to hold tight to a set of core values and principles to develop that core sense of self and what you believe is. And to not ever be held back, particularly if you have an interest working in science and technology. And especially to not ever be held back by the policing around expertise, because we know historically, particularly for women and particularly for people of color, that expertise is defined against identity. And this, I think, is such a critical point of how we navigate these spaces and these hidden political games that we can find ourselves in, possibly particularly for women and for people of color, where there's this false idea of meritocracy and that hard work is the thing that gets us higher in our careers and gets us tenure and out in industry and all that, where really there are so many factors, and sometimes there are these really hidden barriers. And so I'm very grateful for Sarah Myers West and her team, who continue to critique these technology spaces in terms of, again, their paper Discriminating Systems and other work that they're doing in terms of gender and race, while also trying to create, spaces of hope And this quote from her, I think, really speaks to that sense of hope that she's trying to create in her own research.
I'm going to be honest with you, Dylan. I had a lot of thoughts coming away in terms of representation after talking with Sarah Myers West. And when she was talking about the numbers, that really stuck with me quite a bit. She was saying 18% of the leading female authors at AI conferences are female, only 18%, and 80% of AI professors are male. I have been the only female in a computer science class many times before. In classes of like over 30 people, I've been like the only female there. And I've been on computer science development teams at companies where I am the only female among 20 to 30 middle-aged men, mostly white. And yeah, it's a barrier. It is definitely a barrier. It's difficult to work with people who are so drastically different from you. And it's difficult to do your work and stay true to who you are. Unless you, it's hard to just basically try to fit in with people who aren't like you while being you. And I really appreciate what Sarah said, because I think it's important to remember who you are. And unfortunately, in the computer science and in the tech industry, sometimes for women, at least in my experience, sometimes staying true to who you are means leaving. And it's a shame, and it's a hard topic to talk about, one which I'm sure we'll get into much more in later episodes, minisodes, and interviews. But yeah, it's not always easy. But it's important to stay hopeful and to stay authentic.
And that authenticity is something that we really explored in Dr. Ruha Benjamin's episode as well. And as I mentioned, I think in our brief breakdown at the end of that episode, this concept of love is huge for me, especially coming from like a humanities and some people might call, soft science background, where there's this question of what we do with emotions, especially when we start bringing it to, quote unquote, more objective spaces or more scientific spaces. Like, is there a place for emotion? Is there a place for authenticity even? And there's definitely been times where me coming from a humanities background and coming from a ministry background, really, where what we talk about is, spirituality, emotion, and authenticity, where that I've had to tamp that down in my essays or in my research for fear of not being seen as legitimate. So at the end of the interview, we started talking about love with this interview with Ruha. And she said, and I think that love is an essential ingredient to anything that purports to or claims to be radical. In part because love runs against our training as Enlightenment intellectuals, and that's a whole different sphere of life, right? Because love has nothing to do with like the intellectual work of the mind, she said, and that grows out of a very specific trajectory and genealogy that does not serve the vast majority of human beings. And she closed that with the fact that we amputate how we feel about things from what we think about things. So for her, love is an essential ingredient to everything that she does, especially teaching. So kind of to summarize, Ruha was saying basically there's this whole tradition where we separate emotions and love from the work that we do in the academy and in industry and in science and technology. And what I took from what she said is like, what might it be like for us to be able to create space to love in technology, or at least even talk about love? Or what is it like to create space in technology to even talk about authenticity? Or at least how do we make our technological spaces, especially in industry, less toxic to that? Actually, I would add in the academy too. Because there are so many times where I've had to play more political games to just like say the right thing or do the right thing and not be authentic, to protect my career, to get ahead. And I think that's really unfortunate. So I'm still grappling with what she said with that, but I think it's so true that we've been conditioned to separate love and emotion from some of the work that we do. Not all the time, but enough of the time where I think it gets in the way of us really being able to show up and address the deeper systematic problems that we've been introduced to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's almost interesting to think about how it's even possible to remove something like love and passion from your research or from what you're doing at your job, because in some sense those things should be like heavily, deeply rooted and embedded in the work that you do. I know for me, all of my research and, 10 to 12 to 14-hour days that I have doing PhD work, as you know very well, Dylan, too, like that comes from a lot of love. You don't just do that kind of work and hate what you do, There's some sort of driving power and force from deep within that brings us to do the work that we do. And so when you're talking about especially really important topics like social justice issues, that is clearly coming from a deeper place. And it would be not useful to ignore the fact that love is clearly present in those spaces. And I think that was also something that we saw a lot in our interview with Lily Irani, too. Maybe not as much love, but that passion and that emotion. And she mentioned actually anger a lot in her episode. And she brought to light the fact that there are some emotions that we usually think of as really negative that are actually really powerful and useful when it comes to this work. And I think that's just, it's just showing how important it is to really bring your true and authentic self, your angry self, your loving self, your passionate, your authentic self, to the workplace when you do this work, and when you do community building or movement building like Lily Irani is doing, or when you are trying to uproot deep-seated social ideals like Ruha Benjamin is doing. I think it's unavoidable and it's important.
Yeah, I mean that's why. I mean, one of the reasons why I asked Lily about anger is because that's why I got into this work in the first place, honestly. And by this work, I mean just like ministry in general, and now this work in AI ethics. And I was just before we were recording this, I was just showing you a picture from my year abroad back in like 8 years ago, back in college, and I was showing it to you because it was just a silly picture of me where I had a ridiculous haircut. But that year, I mean, I just was able to travel around the world and see the downstream impacts of capitalism, essentially, especially on indigenous populations. And I was so pissed that I decided the best thing to do was to go into ministry to be able to change the world for the better. And it's the same thing now. Like when we were talking to Lily, it is hard not to get so angry at how some of these corporations are treating their labor, or what they're essentially treating as like free labor, that are just like Amazon, right? Playing into some of these historically marginalizing systems of oppression in order to create data that then gets used in order to reinforce these systems of oppression for the same people that have been historically marginalized, and the cycle continues. And it's hard not to get angry. And for me, it's hard not to feel like sometimes disconnected. And so the quote that I pulled from Lily was at the end when we were talking about research and advice that she might have, and how she thinks about her own research. And she asked, I think, this really profound question where she said, what does it look like if I treat research like a social movement instead? And the instead was referring to not as a competitive thing where we as researchers are jockeying for position over jobs and researchers, but what if we're treating our research that we're offering up into the world like a social movement where we're all talking to one another and building this thing together that is hopefully serving for the liberation of all. And for me, that was a very powerful question. I think it's very hard in the systems, at least the academic systems that we're in, to make that shift, because I do believe in a very like Foucault sense, we've been disciplined to be competitive with each other as opposed to collaborative. And I think her challenge is right on. It's just, how do we make this a collaborative space, both in industry and the academy? I sometimes lose hope with that, but I take her call to action very seriously because I think it's what we need to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And hopefully that's something that we're at least trying to start doing while creating this podcast and interviewing people in this space and uplifting, advisors and PhD and doctoral candidates and people who have been in the space for a while, and also uplifting students and people who are just getting into the space. I don't think that academia needs to exist vertically. I think it's a very horizontal field if we all treat it like one. And there's no need to be competitive, especially when it comes to AI and ethics. It doesn't matter who gets the publication out first. It matters that the publication is good and correct and accurate and helpful rather than harmful. And that's honestly something that doesn't happen as often in computer science and in some of the engineering spaces in academia. There is that sense of competition a lot of the time. And so how do we really dig into some of these research topics and some of the work that people are doing and take out of it this sense of camaraderie and this sense that we are all in this together. And if we don't do this together, someone might get left behind.
Jess, do you know what the hardest thing about creating a mini-sode is?
Keeping it short.
Yeah, keeping it mini, exactly. So we're getting to the end of our breakdown. But I was wondering, and this is something we haven't talked about before. It is not in our script. But I was wondering if there was like one takeaway from these last 4 episodes. If you had like one sentence or one thought that you would like to like leave our audience with, like what would it be?
Okay. Well, based off of our conversation today, I would probably say stay passionate, stay authentic, and stay hopeful.
Aw, that's nice.
Thank you.
I like that. Oh, that's better. Well, I asked you first because I
needed more time to think.
One. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I like your, I guess it would be a question. So I like your authenticity. I think that's like a major component of what we heard from our folks, from the folks we interviewed. But I think the question that I'm starting to try to ask myself, and that I would invite listeners to ask yourself, is, God, was it Outkast? God, who was that? Who was that? The Where Is the Love? Do you remember that song, Jess?
No.
Where is the love? Look, I'm gonna while we're okay. Where
the benefits of a Zoom call? You can just Google anything at any time.
Yeah, it was the Black Eyed Peas, right? You remember the Black Eyed Peas?
Sure.
You know, people killing, people die. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Anyway, so I think that's the question that we should be asking ourselves more in whatever work we're doing, wherever we find ourselves situated, is like, where is the love in what you're doing? And like, can you lean into that more? That question of love, which for me, like authenticity is part of that. But where is the love? Just, it's all about the Black Eyed Peas.
Biggest takeaway from the last month: listen to the Black Eyed Peas.
That's right. It's got a great music video too for Where Is the Love. Anyway, so as always, we welcome feedback about our show, about these minisodes, about our interview, about how we're even treating the term radical itself. And as always, you can feel free to show your support by rating, subscribing, sharing the episodes. The way that we get into people's ears is through word of mouth. Like that is the way that this show gets shared. So if you're into what we're doing, please do not hesitate to share it with folks who you think might be interested.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at Radical AI Pod, and as always, stay radical.
Yeah. Okay. Listen to the Black Eyed Peas. Maybe we'll put that in the show notes.
It'll be the outro music.
Yeah. Do we?
We might get copyright.
We probably get in trouble for copyright. Yeah. I don't even know if we have show